So when I was a kid, I had a short stint playing baseball, and after the baseball games, we would go and make these drinks called suicides. Does anyone know what a suicide is? Yeah, where you just take the cup and you go to the fountain and you go to like every single drink, and then like Mountain Dew, Dr. Pepper, and all that, and you get all these flavors, and they're all very different. You're kind of confused, but when you're a kid, it just tastes awesome. You're gonna get a suicide of talks today from the three of us, because we have three totally different things to talk about. My name is Wesley Grubbs. I run a data visualization studio in Oakland called Pitch Interactive. And today I am going to talk about one of our latest projects that we worked on, because it was a really interesting project because of the nature of this project. And there's so much to say about it, but I only have 10 minutes. 10-minute talks are like really hard to do sometimes. So I'm going to try to condense and unpack everything. And it was like data on the road, because that's exactly what it was. The News Lab team at Google invited us to sort of work with them on the presidential debates. And this has been a really crazy election cycle, no doubt. And the whole story about the debates is that they were just like all kinds of stuff going on. And the only data that we actually had to work with was some of the Google data. But essentially, a little bit of background on what this is for. This is for something called the spin rooms. So there is a debate, like we most see on television, and then after the debates, the candidates will go back to these spin rooms where they meet the press, and then they answer questions, and everything's live and going in like real time. In the past, historically, this floor was very similar to how these spin rooms used to be, but it was like fold-out tables on like a basketball floor and like fold-out chairs. It was really crappy. And this year, Google was like, hey, we want to help and build our brand or whatever. They wanted to be more of like a news focus. And so what they decided to do was like sponsor these crazy-ass spin rooms where they would deck it out. And essentially, this is what it looks like. This is kind of the vastness. Like, they're setting this up the day before. It takes them about 12 to 18 hours to set up this entire room. And it's kind of crazy. You can see all these TVs there, all this stuff going on. And it's massive. And the work that we were doing, there's Nick. And the work that we were doing was we were presenting data feeds on all of these displays across the room. When that room was like finished, this is basically what it's like in the end. It's like there's carpet on the floor, architectural, all the stars. It's very like political. There's a barista in the back, like Google snack bars and kind of stuff like that. And our work was on this big display, and then on all of these screens that you see up here. And it was kind of surreal. The data that we worked with is from the Google Trends site. And so really what you have when you go to the Google Trends site, it's interesting stuff. Like you can put in a search word like Donald Trump and kind of see this change, this interest over time. And what that value really is the amount, like the search volume that people do with that. The interesting stuff with the Google data was that you can't see demographics. You don't see race or gender or age or anything like that. All you can see is like what people are searching for. And the interesting thing about this, when you see Donald Trump up there, it says like American politician. You would have this word, this keyword, and it's basically changed into what's called an entity ID. So that anything similar to it, like Drump, or some might say asshole who might potentially ruin our country. Those kind of things get kind of grouped together in this keyword. And so whenever they search for it, like we know how to sort of group those together, and we have this word. And then you can go and you can add other keywords, and you can kind of see how these things change over time. These are sort of like visual outputs on the trend site. They're line graphs, and there's a bar chart. They're not necessarily really interesting stuff to look at. However, they're informative. There's a lot of good information here. And the reason why the News Lab team approached us at Pitch was that we are really good about communicating visual information in entertaining and still informational way. Like we can sort of use much stronger sort of visual cues when we're showing things. And the particular kind of data that we were doing here was called a horse race, where you see sort of, they're like slope charts, like change in ranking over time between things. And so what we had to do was, we had to account for, at one point during the Republican debates, there were 12 people running for president. It was insane. And it was very hard for someone like me to actually look at some of this sometimes. If you know me personally, you know I can have some really strong political viewpoints. But this was also a project where I got to put my my opinions in my pocket, and just sort of be professional about this and just show the information for what it is. And it was really interesting to look at this. And we can sort of drill down and see state by state and how are people changing over the course of a day or an hour or the last 15 minutes, particularly during the debates. So what was interesting about this and why I called this like data on the road was that all of our work was contained in this Pelican case. And there's something like kind of awesome about carrying your work around in a Pelican case. The stakes were really high. And we couldn't fail. It was like running live. Everything's like real-time live feeds. It's going on national television, on every major news network, which like no pressure here, for us. So it was like, okay, fail safe. Let's have like redundant. We had 3 machines, and this like PC was like generating all the content. And we had 2 more. 2 were running live, and 1 was a backup, just in case. And we're running those, and then we kind of came to these like war rooms, like back behind the curtains, like Wizard of Oz style. And like here's the box down here. This is Nick and Jesse. It was fascinating too. Like I do have to give a shout out to our team too. 6 of us, like really great effort by everyone making this happen. There were a lot of flights, a lot of like, it almost seemed like we were giving each other like high five, like flying from California to the East Coast, like, yo, good luck at the next debate. And there was a lot of that going on. The other part about this, though, too, is like we were sort of a piece in this puzzle, and that was a really surreal experience for us. Because you can kind of see in the back, there are AV people, there are other press people, Secret Service, just all this like weird stuff going on. And usually when we would work with this, it's just kind of, we're used to working on like visual projects where we're kind of like in the spotlight or, our work is sort of that key focus. But we're really just like a piece in the puzzle to this. And that was kind of a nice experience. The output of this was this. And I got to see a lot of this particular person and some of the other people and mixed feelings, but like, hey, and it was actually interesting, but we didn't have any control over the outputs. That was supposed to be a cartogram of the United States where you could see like different states showing like different interests. Like maybe Ted Cruz has Texas. I have no idea. No. Donald Trump like dominated everything all the time. And this was like in the news, like these like live feeds. This was like during the actual event. Donald Trump tweets our stuff. And I was just like, shivers, like, I just gave this guy a tool to be more of an asshole. Great, But it was good. I mean, it was like interesting to be part of this. This is sort of like, during the debate, this is one of our very still, clean images walking through the space. I'm joking, it's like totally shaky. But you can see all the motion going on in this room. There's all this stuff going on, and this is like the debate is happening at this moment. And then once the debate's over, the politicians, the people running in the debate will like come to this room in this frenzy. Like everyone's trying to get these questions, they want interviews in front of the wall. And it was really surreal. And sort of like to end this, I think one of the most interesting parts about this was that we had this opportunity and we were able to like early on, we had enough time early on in this project to really plan things out. And it was really important from us, especially from a technology standpoint. And Nick, Adam, Jesse were like, let's get together, let's build a framework that we can actually build upon. And I just, you give them that time and then they build it. And then we have this like really solid structure and what that's done for us as well. And this was like such a successful project for Google. It's very neutral, they don't like to piss people off. And I was kind of happy to be in that position as well. But what it's put us in a position now for is like, we're going to be doing the conventions that are coming up and completely new visuals and completely new sort of outputs and requirements for these spaces, and they're kind of all over the place. I think we're going to be operating like out of a truck, like CIA style, outside of the buildings. And then after that, the actual presidential and vice presidential debates. And it's really kind of fascinating to be standing and being part of this like once in a lifetime sort of experience from an observational standpoint, where you're seeing what people are thinking and how they're searching for things. And, taking this further to kind of see what are the interests, like what are the party platforms and how are people searching for those party platforms and how is that affecting some of the visual outputs? So that was this project. And And that's it. Thanks.
So Dave asked me, he was like, can you present something you've been working on lately? And I'm like, hey man, I've been really getting into these drawings and it's not tech at all. And he was like, this is cool. Just do it anyway. So this is a talk about me drawing obsessively for a while. And my name is Kawandeep Virdee. You can call me Coven, K with an oven. And that's me on the internet. So last year I shared some of my work. The stuff that I put out mostly is interactive sculptural works, or like LED light pieces, things that can hear you, or things that can allow you to draw on a building. And after doing this kind of work and setting it up, it's very, very oriented around people interacting with things and people being creative in public. After sharing it for a while, I like last fall, I was in this feeling that I needed to calm down, and I didn't want to be out, and I didn't want to be speaking at things. I needed some inward reflection. I felt things were very chaotic, and I needed a place of rest. And maybe you've been in this kind of moment, but usually they're created by something very personal happening, and then needing a moment to heal or just think about things, or feel like you're nurturing yourself. So I wanted to I just thought of it like this because, this is sometimes how I think, decreasing my entropy. How can I just make my emotions more predictable? How could I be maybe even a little bit more boring, but be okay with that, staying home? There's so much in our society that's like, go out, make things, produce, and it's like, no, I can be at home and I can be okay. And one of the ways that it manifested was like thinking about things that can be self-nurturing. So things like I'm just combing my hair a lot and feeling like that could be a very healthy gesture, and extending that to I'm going to clean my room a lot all the time, and feeling like every time I do it, things are getting, things are improving. And I found like a creative equivalent of this in a video I saw that the Tate put out of this artist, and I just watched these. You might recognize this incredible genius artist, and just watching this process of drawing and feeling so relaxed. And I was thinking, and I was watching those triangles and these dots, and I was thinking, I want that. This feels kind of like the grooming equivalent, but in a drawing form. So I started messing with the idea, and I wanted to start with something really simple. And it began in a procedural way, so like just vertical lines, very short, down, over and over and over. And then I drew it. And in the process of drawing it, like you could see, this is computer generated, but then I drew it, and then this is what it looks like. And you see all the little variations. On one hand, it could be like, oh, those are mistakes, but I got really into that. I was like, these are variations. This is what makes it interesting. And then I posted it on Instagram, and people were liking it, and I'm like, awesome, I'm doing something good. And it got more likes than anything, and I was like, all right, my selfies aren't going to work anymore. So I started doing like even more drawings like that. And messing with different algorithms, vertical lines, horizontal lines. And at the time, I was also calling my parents because I wanted, self-nurturing, call the parents every week. It's going to be great. And my dad is like, hey, Coven, this is great, but, you can draw these with a computer. I'm like, Dad, I've been doing that for years. I know. And he's like, I'm like, I want to do them by hand. And he's like, no, the computer, though. And I'm like, you just don't get me. But then this happened. So this last one, my dad recently got into photography. So then I wake up one morning and find this in my inbox, and this next one, and he just photo manipulated and sent it back. And I never imagined that my dad and I would be collaborators. Wow, cool! Like we know each other creatively now. And so this was like a huge surprise. And then I just kept on going with it. I went home on Christmas and brought my little notebook to draw, and I was just sitting at the kitchen table drawing all the time. And I know my parents were like, well, what's he doing? This is crazy. But my mom saw this, and she was like, I used to do these drawings as a kid, as a school kid. I'm like, whoa, can you tell me the algorithm? And so she just kind of describes it to me. She's like, well, first you start with this. I'm like, how do you know? And she's like, you just feel it out. And then you just kind of continue it like this. And then I follow her doing it, and then I get this one. And and it's a similar one, and I like hers because she put the face on it, but she looks at mine, she's like, Coven, that's even better than mine. I'm like, Mom, you're such a mom, thank you. And then around then, so I'm just kind of sharing these, doing these moments where, I'm at home doing these drawings. Like, I don't want to be on my phone or my laptop. I'm doing these drawings. I'm feeling very calm. And my buddy is opening up a gallery, and he's like, Coven, I want to exhibit these works. And his gallery is in between, it's this gallery called Open in Boston, and he's thinking about the dialogue between tech and society and opening up that dialogue. And what he saw in these drawings was somebody who was like really into making art with computers, and that was like the most valuable thing, getting into making it by hand and finding value in the certain inadequacies in doing it by hand, but in the end become very interesting. So I was like, yeah, that'd be cool. But I'm looking at this wall and I'm like, these tiny little notebook drawings aren't going to work. So I start thinking, all right, how can I get bigger with this? And I get these markers and I start filming it, and it feels really good. And then it continues pretty obsessively. I start doing these time lapses or live streaming and then time lapses and sharing it. And what's cool is like when people see it like this is more like how I experience it. I'm experiencing it over time, not as just a finished thing. But yeah, just messing with like, this is concentric dashes. But here, I found this really amusing. I'm doing live stream. For some reason, when I'm alone with the computer, I just look so upset. And I'm not really that upset as a person. Like I'm actually, I feel like, when we hang out, I'm probably smiling. But like alone, I'm just like, you can see how there's more body and motion in these movements. And I tell people what songs I'm listening to. And then here, this is one that took a little bit longer. It was a pentagonal tiling. And you could see the first comment is like, go faster. And I'm like, see the time lapse. It's coming. But some people really enjoyed this slow pace. They were like, I find it really therapeutic and relaxing. Something about it being slower and not exciting, but still happening was interesting. And then this is the one that you just saw where, I tweeted this out and people sent me back sounds of old printers. And I'm like, but this was, okay, so once the videos came out, then people started sending back these drawings that they made like on crayons and this was like, whoa. For me, this was really exciting. Like, this was a whiteboard on the left that was supposed to be a to-do list, and when she was drawing it, the doodle suddenly overtook the whole thing. And it was on a whiteboard, so it wasn't going to last. And to confirm that, she just stepped in the middle of it. And I'm like, you were so bold. I could never do that. I could never destroy it like that. But she messaged back saying, oh, it was very, like, I felt that meditative moment in this gesture. And then I hung one of them up, and it was really cool, because, like, then the next day, like, I'm seeing these selfies with it. And I'm like, whoa, you want to associate with it. Rad. And I think it kind of, like, if there's a portrait and you stand in front of it, people are like, hey, you're blocking the portrait. But like with one of these things, it's like, oh, it's a pattern. We know what happens behind that pattern. So it kind of invites you to stand in front of it. And I kind of like to think of it as like giant confetti hugs. So I really enjoyed playing in that scale, like hanging up this canvas and feeling it almost comforting like a giant blanket. And then my parents visit again, and they were like, Coven, you should consider this kind of pattern. I'm like, just draw it. And then so my dad's drawing it, and then my mom's drawing it, and I'm kind of agreeing. And then we hang up the show, and there's lots of these giant canvases, and then there's an opening, and then people come, and then this happens. Like lots of really fun selfies, and then I just compile them, and then some of them even become like people taking them with their friends. Some of them become like Facebook photos. I feel like that's the holy grail. You're on a Facebook profile photo? Yes. Like, this is the best art dissemination. But then it's like, where does it go from here? And it's like kind of a familiar form. So like a buddy who's an architect, she like rendered it like this, and we submitted to the city. Like, what if this happened in Boston Commons? And people saw us and they were like, whoa, that would be wild. And then the city sent this back to me a couple days ago, and they were like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if this wall happened? And I'm like, you telling me? Yeah. And Sands, who you saw speak yesterday, he's doing these laser cut acrylic pieces, and then put one of my postcards behind it and posted an image, and I was like, whoa, this is another possibility. So these patterns, they're really familiar and kind of versatile in a way that I didn't expect, like compared with the interactive work I was doing before, where, here I was doing it, and I was like, there's no glamour or anything interesting in a marker. Like before, it was like the tech and the LEDs, and that was the exciting part. But now it's like, well, you can make something exciting with a marker, and then other people can do it too. So it kind of became interactive as well. There's going to be a show tomorrow evening with a piece. I'm still doing little doodly drawings. But yeah, the thing that I value most is like, if my pieces are about people being expressive, this is kind of encouraging that. Like, you take up the marker, the pen yourself, do it, send it to me, and we did it together. Cool, thanks so much.
Really awesome to get to be here. And I'm going to be talking about some work that's I'm kind of in the middle of. I just finished like a draft of a really long essay, and I kind of thought for, 10 minutes isn't a lot of time, so I'm kind of going to be throwing a bunch of questions that I'm working through at you, and maybe during the Q&A, you can answer them for me. And this starts as like line of work that I've been doing for the last few months. Kind of starts with a problem that I've been having with Silicon Valley, and that problem is that, well, it's really with people who talk about Silicon Valley, because when people say those two words together, they don't really mean a place so much as they mean like an ideological condition that like happens to people, places, and things. And this kind of bothers me for a lot of reasons, but the primary one being, that political conditions emerge and are tied to political geographies. Like, things happen in places for reasons, and I have kind of complicated connections back to the peninsula of Northern California that made me really kind of want to investigate like that landscape and that history and see if there were things that kind of could be like gleaned from it. The problem with trying to find history in the landscapes of Silicon Valley is most of the landscapes look like this. For pretty much every like mile of like kind of gleaming tech campus busily inventing the future, there's about 5 miles of like strip malls and suburban tract housing and some like weird office parks. And so it's kind of hard to like find things, like history becomes this thing that you kind of notice out of the corner of your eye while you're like merging onto an on-ramp. This is probably one of my favorite examples of a weirdly positioned history in Silicon Valley. This is a commemorative plaque at 844 East Charleston Road in Mountain View, California, and it marks the site where in 1959, Fairchild Semiconductor created the first commercially practicable integrated circuit. This is the parking lot that commemorative plaque looks out onto. This kind of mountain view looks like this most of the time. And this is a document called a restrictive covenant, and it's issued by the California Regional Water Quality Control Board. And it basically explains all the things you can't do at 844 East Charleston Road. You can't build a daycare center. You can't build a school. You can't build a hospital. And the reason you can't do those things is because the groundwater underneath 844 East Charleston Road is contaminated with volatile organic compounds, solvents, things that were used in the manufacture of semiconductors. And this sort of weird confluence of like landmark of technical innovation and like lots of toxic waste is like fairly common in the region. There are 23 federal Superfund sites in Silicon Valley, which the EPA conveniently provides as points. Thanks, guys. And there are even more sites that are kind of managed by like the state that I was able to get in polygons. I think another thing that's kind of hard about telling narratives about this region is that Santa Clara County, which roughly we can consider the contours of Silicon Valley, is very large and sprawling. And so like the scale of this is kind of hard to really like articulate. I find this history and find a lot of these like sites and their like kind of intricate little histories really interesting, because I think they offer an opportunity to like play with this question of sort of like what we get to tell as computer history. Because I feel like for the kind of person who thinks that Silicon Valley is like an ideological parasite and not like a landscape, computer history is something like this. It's some like guys with beards having cool ideas in like in these sort of abstract, removed from like kind of the concerns of everyday life environments. This is Xerox PARC, just for reference. But when you kind of start to go back to return to these sites and try and understand kind of like what's literally below the surface of them, which is, poison mostly, computer history starts to take on this really interesting valence of being also a history of labor struggle. This is a flyer from, I think, like the late 70s and 80s from attempts to kind of organize workers who had no idea what they were being exposed to, and no one was really dealing with the fact that a lot of them were getting cancer. And, in this realm, computer history becomes this history of a weird way in which like innovation acts as this instrument of plausible deniability, which I don't think I can talk too much more deeply into in 10 minutes, but maybe later. Broadly speaking, it's just trying to say that the legacy of this is an industrial one, that computer history is not a history of merely like clever notions made with machines. It's the making of machines. And the landscapes of this region do not lend themselves readily to telling that story, or they lend themselves to telling the story of how that stuff gets hidden or like obscured. These are a set of groundwater like cleanup pumping stations. Basically, like the bad water goes into those tanks, they filter out all of the bad parts, and they put the not as bad water back in, and then the toxic waste goes somewhere else. That's another whole interesting story. This is the parking lot that you can view from the groundwater tanks. In the background, that's the Apple campus that's currently under construction. There's a lot of parking lots. A lot of pictures of parking lots in this slide deck. The point being, I think, like these slatted, fenced things, I think are a really interesting thing that I saw a lot just driving around the region over the last few months. And, they're part of this longer legacy that is kind of part of the architectural landscape of the region. In 1951, when Stanford University first built out the Stanford Industrial Park to try and lure more high-tech companies into Palo Alto, they made all these deliberate choices to basically make a really unindustrial industrial park. There were trees and lawns, and it was a campus, right? And David Packard had this line that I really loved where he talked about how they were encouraging what he called light industry of a non-nuisance type that would also, I think in his words, attract a better class of workers. I think there's a weird way in which this pursuit of frictionlessness and seamlessness lends itself not only to the kind of, landscape architecture that dominates a lot of kind of new developments in the valley today, but also just a sort of cultural expectation that is built into the devices, built into the culture around these things, not seeing the seams, the edges, the places where people get hurt. I don't have a lot of time here, so I guess I'm going to throw the really hard questions at you for the end, which is, I'm not sure kind of what to do with these stories. They're things that I'm having a lot of fun kind of reading about and writing about, but at the end of the day, it's it's going to take decades for this stuff to actually get cleared out of the ground. And it would be, I assume it goes without saying that this is not a story that has ended. It is mostly relocated. This is a protest outside a Samsung facility in South Korea in September of last year. Workers there continue to struggle to get recognized for the kind of health hazards that they were exposed to and continue to be exposed to. And I guess ultimately, for me, this is kind of about a larger question of how to advance a holistic critique and holistic approach to living with machines. This is part of a quote by Ursula Franklin. And it's, appropriate soil, groundwater anyway. And I guess, I don't know, it is hard in a world where it's very easy to be rewarded for performing triage. To be the person who wants to say, let's talk about preparing the soil. It's hard in a world that's on fire to be trying to deal with long-term maintenance problems. But this year, I guess I've just been looking for things that can kind of keep me honest. And that's one of the only ways that I know how to stay honest, is to deal with that sort of long-term heavy lifting sort of work. Thank you.
Coven, what type of markers are you using?
Where did that come from?
From outer space.
Oh yeah. As I was starting to make them bigger, I started looking at two artists, Chantal Martin and Kitty Ann Gilmore, and they both do larger scale murals. And I think Chantal uses Crinks, and Kitty Ann Gilmore uses Montana. And I've been recently getting more into Montana just because I can get a range of acrylic colors, and then it doesn't smell as intense as the permanent markers.
So I've got a question for all three of you. Wes, you talked about the fact that you're doing visualization work for a candidate that you don't necessarily like, or
Not for a candidate, but
not for a party that
Yeah.
you might not otherwise support. Kevin, you found your way into drawing after, different kinds of sculptural work. So you found your way into another kind of practice that's keeping you honest. And Ingrid, you just made a comment about pursuing this work of documenting Superfund Silicon Valley as a way of keeping yourself honest. So you are all talking about a kind of turn in your own work. And I wondered if you could kind of reflect on that for a second.
You found our theme.
Totally.
I thought there might be a theme there. Yes.
Is it the theme of mindfulness?
Oh, but that
I'll
I
let
feel
you
like
guys
that
name
word's
it.
gotten ruined almost.
Authenticity.
Okay.
Oh, even worse. I mean, I think there is something maybe to the pursuit of, like, I don't know, one of the things that I was thinking a lot with your talk was just the way in which it's like getting into kind of like things that are going to take a long time. Like the entire reason you use a computer is faster than a human, right? And so like the pursuit, kind of the like attempt to kind of return to like something that it's like, it's not just going to be easy, or, well, it's not easy. Computers aren't easy. They're very hard, but does that kind of, so it's like kind of returning, like thinking about like the time scale in which you're operating. Cause I think that is also kind of an interesting thing. Like working in an election cycle, like in a media cycle, is like such a weird time scale, I imagine. Like,
Yeah, especially when you don't agree with it. Like you have very mixed feelings. I think I don't know, we're challenging ourselves in sort of new dimensions. I think it's almost, it's also like a level of maturity or evolution or growth or something to that regard. Just being, I guess, more thoughtful
I
about.
think I'm also like less scared of my own death.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, like.
But then why do you care about saving the environment?
I don't. That's not actually the point, though. It's not about
Right.
saving per se. But I mean, the point being, like working on a durational time scale rather than desperately rushing to like the next thing, or like kind of being in this sort of death drive to like make as many rad things because like you gotta just like keep producing stuff because like capitalism says so.
I feel that so much. Yeah. For some when I was doing the tiny notebook ones, like it was to the point where it was going to take forever. So then I had to, if the drawing itself was going to bring me joy, I was going to be miserable because it was going to take forever to get to it. So I was trying to find enjoyment in the process of doing it. And so some of what you're talking about like, all right, not thinking about this like end achievement and this hyper ambition and this need to produce was like this was trying to create certain exercises to help celebrate that, celebrate that process and not need to like produce.
I had to produce. Totally different. Yeah, I mean, I run a studio. I mean, the good thing with that we try to balance at the studio is definitely like a work-life balance for sure. I mean, Californians, but also to take that, use that to our advantage to have these like larger projects, and then also be able to like step back and do personal stuff. Like the drones, we did the drones piece we did a few years ago, which was completely self-funded, and it took us a month to do that of our own time, and it was for a subject matter that we really cared about. I mean, it's a balance, but everyone, I guess, we're all approaching this a little differently. Any more questions?
Hi, this is for Wesley, right? Yes, you. You were just talking about how you had to produce, and I was wondering if you think that the data that I would assume because you were working with Google, you were using Google's data, and if you think that search terms in a debate are actually or could be reflective of the way people think about political issues, and if there's an actual relationship between, I guess what I'm trying to say is if the data was objective enough to actually learn something, or if it's just really cool to look at that data and think that you're learning something.
That's a really great point. We're working with Simon Rogers, and before Google, he was at The Guardian. Like, he sort of digitized all of Guardian stuff when like the New York Times API came out and Guardian had theirs. Simon's a really great person to work with. And that's exactly our angle. Like, this was one of the first projects that we've taken really from a journalistic standpoint. We're trying, you're trying to find a story. You're not trying to force it, or trying to make assumptions. We weren't making assumptions. The only thing we were trying to show is like, we know that this is being searched for more than this, Our next phase of where we're going to is really, okay, how does this lie with the issues? Where's gun control in this? And how has like ISIS changed in the last couple of years versus Taliban? If you take the last like 10 years of this nation of like what people have searched for in regards to terrorism or gun control or abortion, and and then you see this fluctuation of like, when was abortion important, or is it becoming less? And it's just because people are searching for it less. Is that accurate? That's a really great question. It's sort of, there was this question about Google flu trends and the CDC data, and like matching up people like searching for like cold medicine and symptoms of flu and all this, marrying that, and we actually did a piece for Popular Science a few years ago on that, and there was a correlation. And then meanwhile, I think there was some research that was refuting it and saying, oh, it's not, but there are two sides of that coin. I mean, what we saw with that data was, yes, Google flu trends and CDC data, they match up very closely most of the time. But not all the time. There are those anomalies, or something comes up in the news, or Zika virus. I mean, there's all these things that happen, and actually, I guess for us, what's interesting is to see how does the media that we're sort of feeding information to, how it's sort of like you feed it feeds back. This sort of feedback loop that kind of goes through this. And for me, it's not so much of trying to find the answers. It's trying to understand like human behavior. How are we thinking as a society, and how is that shaping us? Because I think that's something I think about a lot.
Question for Ingrid. I was wondering if you dug into any places outside of Silicon Valley that have a similar kind of identity change and long tail from it.
Now, I mean, mostly have kind of been focused pretty heavily on this region. I mean, there are other. I mean, of course, there are countless Superfund sites. Superfund sites from electronics through the United States are like, they're scattered around. I think Santa Clara County is kind of interesting because of just the sheer concentration. Like, it's more Superfunds in any county than like anywhere in the United States. And in a weird way, I mean, and this didn't completely come through, but I think it's only kind of a sea change and shift, right? I mean, it's like, okay, you kind of go from hardware to software, but there's this sort of logic of abstraction of material labor that kind of runs throughout the entire timeline and continuum that I think is kind of interesting, and a certain kind of like corporate logic that starts to shape certain decisions that's like kind of repeats itself through the timeline.
It may be a little bit after the fact, but as you were talking about feedback loops, I couldn't help but think the three of you as public artists and designers putting your work in the world, it's sort of an extension of that question, thinking about how, like, as somebody, I Googled Trump a lot because I just wanted to watch these, but I also know a lot of people like me who had no interest in ever voting for him, were Googling him. And I was trying to think about how that feedback loop of the information that was being presented affected the voting population. And then I just wanted to extend that question off of US, and similarly, Coven, with your work, as you were live streaming it, I want to get a sense of kind of what feedback loops you felt, how you're affecting. And then Ingrid, I can't walk down a street without thinking about all the pipes and markings.
Sorry.
And they're fun glasses to wear. So if you could talk a little bit about the feedback loops in your product.
Such a deep topic. I mean, for me, I think that this particular scenario, especially with this political landscape right now, we're in it. It's moving, and I feel like what's going on with like the media and now technology and Facebook and Google, Twitter, all this stuff. I feel like this is going to be something that's going to be researched for years, if not decades. Of like something is going on. Like it's information. Like people are typing on Drumpf or negative stuff. Like how do we get rid of him? And that we know, but it's still somehow he still got what he got. Like all this attention and that it's fascinating. I guess for me it's something that I'm constantly thinking about. Wakes me up at night sometimes, of like how is all this kind of it's going in together. So it's interesting thought. Thanks for keeping me up tonight.
Really fantastic question, because it's like really. So I think like when I think of this feedback loop aspect in doing the drawings, like it was so different from what I did before that I had sort of an issue of identity, like what like this doesn't fall in line with anything I was working before. Can I represent myself with it? But it was the moment when there was an opportunity for that feedback that started to make me realize the way it could tie into my previous work. Like what I found most joyful in the previous work was like seeing other people take it and make it their own, making it a point of dialogue and conversation. The work itself could facilitate that conversation. So like I'll start live streaming And then this was around when Facebook just opened up live for people to start playing with it, and would just broadcast it to everyone's feed, like even people I hadn't seen in like 10 years. So it was really amusing that people who I hadn't even been in touch with for that long would just, get this image of me drawing. It's like, what is Coven doing? But that would start that conversation, or, start some amusing jokes. And then, then that allowed for, I'd post something else, like maybe a digital piece I was working on, and no one likes it. So then I'm like, all right, well, I guess I'm a drawer now. And that feedback, it kind of like was very creatively motivating in certain ways. And probably even more fulfilling than the works itself was how it would allow me to connect with, in some cases, like with my parents in new ways.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like recently heard somebody from like the IETF or something talking about how like a lot of the work that they do is like about the quest for boring, which is to say like you want to make something that like people will like come to take for granted. And I feel like part of what I do is like, kind of act as like a thorn in that, because I just think boring things always are going to like secretly, like there's something interesting to them, otherwise they wouldn't be so goddamn boring. Like someone had to make it like, and I don't know, something Aaron Cope, who's a person who I think a lot about when I make stuff, said, which is, the point of civil society is to build things that people will take for granted, right? Like you just have running water. And I think a lot about the like not wanting to live in a world where I take things for granted. And I think that drives a lot of the way that I think through the kinds of like places that I get interested in and the kinds of stories that I try to like dig up.
Okay. So,
It's-
Google Trends aggregates together a lot of data.
Right.
Cut, copy, repeat in Illustrator, lets you do one thing repeatedly over and over again, but you lose, some of the variation that happens in the repetition. And, working at industrial scales allows you to hide things like, toxic waste problems very easily. What are details that you found that would have been lost had you not taken a closer look at it?
I guess for us, the realization, kind of the interesting stuff, was just the liveness of what we were doing, the like instant. A lot of the Google Trends stuff, like the interesting part is we didn't even have access to like the really deep stuff. It was all aggregated, which most people working in data visualization hate aggregated data because somebody is telling you what you have to be doing. But at this time, there were security issues and, just certain, just concerns. And even the team we were working with didn't have access, like at levels deeper. So we had to work on this like very almost shallow, but very vast amount of data. So I guess for us, the patterns were kind of there. Our goal was to try to visualize what those mean, especially in terms of like, how are people ranking in this minute versus that minute? That was kind of our thought.
Moving across different scales, what are certain characteristics that are revealed? I really like that focus of scale-dependent properties. It makes me think of fractals, but in a more deeper way. And I think like the first thing I noticed is the relationship between, very specific, width of the line and then the dimensions of the canvas. That a line, like the notebook drawings, for instance, took a really long time to do because it was a tiny, tiny line. The giant canvases would sometimes be much faster because it was a thicker marker, but people would value it differently. So you make something bigger than someone, it can consume them. It is valuable. And I would like look at this. I remember the first time I hung the canvas, I like looked at it and I was like, I mentioned it earlier in the talk, like this blanket thing. I was like, man, that's the most comforting thing ever. But then even when I was hanging it up, I wrapped myself in one, and it was really wonderful. So I guess like in that case, it's sort of like a body media interaction kind of thing. From it's in my hand, like, and we meet tonight, and you're like, what do you do? And I'm like, check out my drawings. And then to like, you see the giant piece and you want to wrap yourself in it. Like, I guess it's different opportunities for the different scales of interaction.
I guess for me, the like looking at and vacillating between different scales. I'm gonna do this. Was actually I considered like making this anecdote like the whole 10-minute talk, so hopefully I won't go a whole 10 minutes. But I guess I've become like it's been interesting to look at examples of ways in which forensic evidence or like technical truths hit against kind of visceral human truths in a lot of these contexts. So like most of these contamination incidents didn't affect drinking water because let's not talk about the history of California water politics, but one of the first cases that kind of actually like made people aware, like, oh, there might actually be like a huge like toxic waste problem in Silicon Valley was something that affected drinking water in one part of South San Jose. And there was this moment where this one like neighborhood called Los Paseos, residents started to notice like there's this really weird rash of like miscarriages and children born with heart defects and incidents of cancer that are like in these kind of pervasive clusters, and you're telling us that our water has been contaminated with trichloroethylene and we don't know for how long, and this, we want answers, right? Understandable. And there were like several like, you know, studies done. I read two that were kind of from the like Journal of like American Epidemiology or something, and all of them, you know, epidemiological truth is very different from knowing that your neighbor had a miscarriage and being able to like prove with any statistical significance that the fact that Fairchild like dumped all of these chemicals into their drinking water had any relationship to the harms imposed on the community is hard because of scale, because of sample size. And I feel like there is a weird kind of resonance to that tendency in terms of thinking about like harms that technologies perform in general and the use of a certain kind of technical truths for what is like not at all a technical harm.
So thank you, everybody.